So now we're going to talk about how to use quotes. So we've done some quoting already, we've talked about it a little bit already, but quoting is one of those things that you have to practice at a lot before you get really good at it. So you've had some basics about quotes, now we're going to get a little more in depth, and then later on we'll talk even more about it and talk about weird circumstances that can come up while you're quoting. But for right now, we're going to do kind of a mid-level, intermediate discussion of quoting. So first of all, let's talk about why should you use quotes. It adds credibility to your writing. So it shows you've done your research, you've gone out and found sources on your topic, and now you want to show us what those sources have to say. It shows us what the sources are actually saying, so we know the information you're giving us is correct. If we can read your quotes and understand what your source is saying, then that makes us more trusting that all the information that you're giving us is accurate. Quotes are often used to highlight particularly striking phrases or sentences, and just kind of help give us a better understanding of your topic and what people think about your topic. And then finally, of course, using quotes and citing them correctly helps you avoid plagiarism. Now, in your Bridging the Difference book, you've got a section that is all about quoting and how to use quotes and how to use them and cite them in different scenarios. Please make use of that, because I can't go over every single possible thing that you might come up or conditions that you might come across as you're quoting. So please, if there's something you're confused about, consult those pages first. Be proactive. You might be able to find the answers to the questions that you have just as easily as opening up your book and flipping through the pages. So quotes, you don't want to overquote. You know, a few quotes per page is fine, but you want most of the information that you give, most of the format you give the information in, to be in your own words. So summarizing and paraphrasing you can do a lot of. Quoting you want to do a little bit less of than you would summarizing and paraphrasing. So quotes, like I said, you know, about 2 per page, maybe 3 is going to be enough quotes. And so you really want to use quotes that are good, strong quotes that say it better than you think you could say it. So boring generic quotes, don't use those. Don't pick those. Use really good, strong quotes. If you're reading your original source and you're like, whoa, that was just a great sentence, the way that that person put that information, that's a good sentence to quote. So when you quote, it needs to be identical to the original passage, except there's a couple of little ways you can tweak it that we've mentioned before. You can use brackets to add or change words. So this is something that you want to do if the part of the quote that you're choosing isn't really being clear, and you feel like you want to give your audience more information. Add in some words so that they know exactly what the quote is talking about. This is also something you'll have to do if your quote does not fit grammatically correctly with the sentence that you've put it in. So even though quotes are supposed to be word for word, when you have your introduction to them and then you give the quote, if the quote doesn't match up, if it doesn't read grammatically correctly from the beginning of that sentence with your introduction on through the quote, you do need to change that quote. And so this is something as simple as sometimes adding ing on the end of verbs to make them be in the right tense or things like that. So just read your quotes from beginning to end, meaning start with the introduction, then read through the quote, and make sure it all fits grammatically correctly. Ellipses, so that's the ... Ellipses are often used if you have a lot of information, a long quote, and you feel like, okay, here's a piece over here that I really, really like, And then here's a piece down here that I really, really like, but there's a lot of junk in the middle that I don't need. That's when you put the dots. Or even if you just want to leave out a couple of words. So whether you're cutting out entire sentences or paragraphs or just a couple of words, you'll still use those 3 dots, and that just shows, okay, I left something out here. Quotes always have to be attributed to the original source, which is often going to be the author. But if you don't have an author, then you'll give credit to the title. So say you have an article from a database that does not have an author, you'll use the title as if it's the author. So if your article is called Legalize It, you can say, in the article, legalize it, blah, 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 and then you'll give your quote. Just the same way that you would say, the author, John Doe, argues. You can use it, the title or the author in the same way. Now, you do want to use the author if you have one. So you'll only give the title name if you don't have an author for your source. So I'm going to introduce here the idea of the quote sandwich. And those of you who go on to Comp 102, you're going to hear a lot more about the quote sandwich because you're going to have to read a book that talks about it in depth. And so you might as well start getting used to the idea now. So the quote sandwich is a nice little metaphor to help you remember what you're supposed to do with quotes. So when you're quoting from a source, you can't just randomly stick a quote in your paper. You've got to set us up for the quote, and then you've got to have some kind of way to link that quote back into your paper. And so thinking of it like a sandwich will help you remember that. So the first piece of bread is where the quote comes from. So usually the author's name and credentials. John P. Smith, a psychologist at Johns Hopkins University, says, something like that. Now, you don't have to do this every time. So if you're quoting John P. Smith, the very first time you give his name, you want to tell us who he is. But after that, if you quote from him again, you can just call him Smith. You can just say, according to Smith, because we already know who he is. So introduce the source to us the very first time you mention it. Other than that, you can just say the author's last name. Signal phrases we'll talk about in just a second, but again, they're just action words. They're verbs like argues and illustrates and points out. The meat of that sandwich, or for the vegetarians, the peanut butter and jelly, what goes in the middle is the quote itself with the citation information. So that's where you'll give us the actual quote with quotation marks around it, and then citation information. So that means if there's a page number, that needs to go in parentheses after the quotation marks and before the period. If you didn't introduce in that first piece of bread the author's name, you'll then need to put the author's name in parentheses. So the author's name only has to come one time, either in the introduction or in parentheses. Don't do both. That's technically incorrect. But just make sure that if you're not using it in the introduction, if you've got some other way of introducing your quote, that you do put the author's name in parentheses after the quote, in the same place that you will be putting the page numbers if you have page numbers. The final piece of bread, this is often the trickiest piece and the piece that students are most likely to forget or skip out of laziness. So this is where you comment on the quote. So you'll do something like break down what the author is saying, or tell us what you think the quote, why you think the quote is important, or explain how the quote applies to your paper. So the idea behind this is you don't just want to slam a quote into your paper and not tell us why you're using it, because we're going to be scratching our heads going, well, wait a second, why did you include this quote? I don't get it. Quotes do not speak for themselves. Don't assume that you've put a quote in there and your audience is going to know exactly why you chose that quote and where it came from and what we're supposed to get from it. So this last piece of bread is really important, and like I said, it's the piece that students skip the most, And I'm not sure if that's out of laziness or forgetfulness or what, but you do need to be letting us know why you're including that quote in your paper. So signal phrases are things like argues and claims, explains, proves, states. There's a lot of different signal phrases that you can use. Now, the only two rules that there really are for signal phrases are, one, don't use the same one over and over again. I see a lot of people using states, and that's all they ever use. That gets really boring to read. So kind of vary it up a little bit. Pick at least 2, maybe 3 different ones, and you can kind of go back and forth between them. So that's the first rule. The second rule is make sure that your quote is actually doing what you're saying it's doing. So don't say so-and-so argues if they're not actually arguing anything. Don't say that they're claiming or implying something if they're not. So make sure whichever signal phrase you use, that's what the quote is actually doing. So let's look at a bad example of a quote, and we'll see why not using the quote sandwich is bad. So here's an example. Wendy's is the best fast food restaurant there is. Their burgers are awesome. Wendy's is one of the most popular fast food restaurants in America. So can you tell now why it's bad to just throw a quote into your paper and not introduce it and not explain it? So this is what happens when you do it that way. First of all, we're left going, okay, who said this and why should I care? Because there's no introduction. For all we know, this could be some bum on the street who's never eaten at Wendy's. This could be the CEO of Wendy's, who is obviously very biased. So we need to know where this information came from. We need to know who said it and what that person's credentials are and why we should care that they said it. Those sorts of things. Secondly, why are you including this quote? What does it have to do with anything? The connections are not being made here. We don't understand where this quote is coming from or why it's being used. And this is a bad example of quote use. Now here's a better example. Wendy's has developed a reputation as a great fast food restaurant in part due to their fresh-made burgers. As frequent customer Joe Smith confirms, their burgers are awesome. These burgers have helped make Wendy's one of the most popular restaurants in America. So now we can see how much better it is when you use the quote sandwich. So first of all, we have as frequent customer Joe Smith confirms, so we know where this information is coming from. It's coming from Joe Smith, and we know who he is. He's a frequent customer. That's why we should care what he has to say. He's one of these people that has made Wendy's such a big restaurant through going back and eating their burgers. So now we know who he is. Here's what he says. And now we're going to tie it all together. Why are we including this quote about their burgers? Well, because it's these burgers that have helped make Wendy's one of the most popular restaurants in America. So now we're tying it all together. This is a good example of what the quote sandwich is and how it works and how it lets anyone who reads your paper know where your quotes came from and why we should care about the quotes that you're using and how it fits into what you're trying to tell us. So this is a good example that you want to model when you're using your quotes. So we're going to look at a few more examples, and here's our original quote, and this is coming from an author whose last name is Goleman, and he's a psychologist. Ooh, that's spelled wrong. Okay. One of the main reasons underage drinking is so harmful is that the human brain isn't fully developed until a person reaches the age of 25. So teens are psychologically incapable of making responsible decisions about drinking. So for those of you writing your topic on underage drinking, this is one of the common reasons that's given for why people don't want to lower the drinking age. So here we have this viewpoint. Now we're going to put this into our paper. We want to quote this. So there's a couple of ways you can do it. Here's one of them. Goleman, a psychologist, explains that, quote, the human brain isn't fully developed until a person reaches the age of 25, so teens are psychologically incapable of making responsible decisions about drinking. So we've got our introduction. We've got our introduction that says who said it, and we've got the credentials of that person. We've got our quote, and then we've got our page number. And notice, again, here's the end quotes, here's the parentheses with the number, the page number included, and then the period. And then we've got our explanation. What Goleman is essentially saying is that lowering the drinking age would not be a good idea based on the underdeveloped brain function of young people. So this shows us how it all ties together. So again, this is another good example of using the quote sandwich. Let's look at another example. We know from research that, quote, and then we've got our quote, and then we've got the author's last name and the page number. So remember before I said usually you're going to introduce who said the information in the introduction, but you don't always have to do it. You can use other ways of introducing your quotes. And so we've got this introduction here that doesn't include the author's name, so we just want to make sure after our quote that we include the author's last name along with the page number here in parentheses. So again, you've got these two different options. And notice up here, because I said the author's last name in the introduction, I didn't include it in parentheses. So you only need to say the author's name one time. This is another thing that a lot of students get confused about and do incorrectly. So just make sure you mention the author's name one time. If we didn't know the author's name, we could put the title here. We could say the article, Why the Drinking Age Shouldn't Be Lowered, explains that, and then give our quote. Or if we did it down here, instead of the author's name in parentheses, it would say, why the drinking age shouldn't be lowered in quotation marks. So we would be using the article name exactly the same way that we would the author's name. Here's our last piece of bread in the second example. This is an important piece of information to remember when deciding whether or not to lower the drinking age. So here we have kind of a paraphrase. So this is one thing that you can do when you're trying to come up with that last piece of bread. What you should put for it is you can practice your paraphrasing skills, and you can paraphrase what the quote has already said. Now, if you do this, make sure you do a good paraphrase. What really frustrates me is when people in this last piece of bread pretty much say exactly what the quote just said. So, for example, you don't want to say something like, what Goleman is essentially saying is the human brain is not developed until a person is 25 years of age. Because that's exactly, almost word for word, what the author is saying. That's basically plagiarism. So make sure that if you use this method, you use a good paraphrase. I don't want you to be a parrot. Don't turn around and say exactly what the quote already says. So for that last piece of bread, again, it requires a little bit of critical thinking, good understanding of what the source is saying. Make sure you understand what your source actually means. When you're struggling to figure out exactly what to do with that last piece of bread, you can often say something like, what the author is essentially saying is, and then give a good paraphrase. Or you can say something like, this is important because, and then think about, why did you choose that quote? What is it doing within the structure of your paper? There's got to be a reason why you chose it, and don't choose quotes randomly. So tell me how this fits into your paper, what you think this is doing as far as the points that you're trying to sum up. So things to remember with quotes, if you introduce the author before the quote, you don't need to cite their name again in parentheses, But if you didn't introduce your author's name before the quote, you will need to include parentheses and make sure that author's name is there, or the title if there is no author. Other things, the period always goes after the parentheses in short quotes. So for example, you can see we've got parentheses, so the period goes right there. If you didn't have parentheses, then you would just have the end of your quote, as in our previous example. So in our previous example, if we didn't have parentheses, the period would go right there. Oops. All right. So the other thing to remember is if you have page numbers, nothing goes in the parentheses other than the page number or the author's name as well if you're including both in parentheses. So don't write out the word page, don't put P period, don't put a comma. It's just the author's last name and the page number. Or if you already introduced the author, just the page number. If you don't have a page number, leave that out. If you don't have an author, again, remember you'll treat the title as if it were the author. Longer quotes. So long quotations mean it runs more than 4 lines in your paper. And if you're looking at it, just use your best guess as to whether or not it's more than 4 lines. Obviously, if it's 5 and 6 lines, it's more. But if it looks almost like 4, but you're not really sure, I'm not going to be taking it out of your paper and seeing if it really fits into 4 lines or not. So just use your best approximation when you're looking at it. But it gets formatted completely differently. Why? Because MLA wants to confuse you. That's the only idea I can come up with. But anyway, in this case, you'll introduce the quote and you'll put a colon. It's always a colon. You don't use quotation marks. You start on a new line, so you have to hit the enter key, and then you have to hit tab and indent that line. You actually indent every line of the quote. And then you'll cite the quote in parentheses and put the final punctuation before the citation instead of after. So it's completely backwards from the shorter quote format. Again, I think MLA sometimes just wants to confuse you. So here's what it looks like when you put it all together. So see, we've got our introduction, we've got our colon, and then we're going to hit enter and we're going to tab over every line. We have a period and then parentheses with the information in there. And once again, if you introduce the author's last name up here, you wouldn't need to put it again. So just like with works cited stuff, I don't expect you to memorize the format for these long quotations. You can just look them up, and they're on page 35 through 36 in Bridging the Difference, or you can just Google how to format longer quotes, or block quote format is what it's sometimes called. So you can find this information and then just go down the list and make sure yours looks like the example given in the book. Okay, so here's your writing assignment on quotes. I want you to pretend you're writing an essay on the positive and negative effects of using cell phones and electronic devices in classrooms. And you're going to use the source below as a negative viewpoint on the topic. So you're going to demonstrate how you would quote from this source, and don't forget to use the quote sandwich. So here is your information. This source is Sandra Lopez, who is a high school principal, and you're getting this from page 621. And here is the information. Students' cell phone use in classrooms, where they're supposed to be getting an education, not browsing social media sites, has gotten completely out of hand. It's become a distraction to both teachers and students, and studies prove this selective attention decreases students' ability to learn. There are many proposed solutions that stop the behavior briefly, but the only solution that stops it entirely is for schools to implement a school-wide ban on them. If we want to take care of this problem, we have to be willing to confiscate any phone we see in order to protect the quality of the school's learning environment. All right, so again, pretend you're writing an essay on this topic. You can pick whatever from this passage you want to. So you can do a couple of sentences, you can do one sentence, you can do a part of a sentence, however you want to do it. But what I'm looking for with this writing assignment is that you properly use the quote sandwich format. So meaning you understand how you should introduce the source, that you're using signal phrases, that you're using quotation marks around your quote, that you're correctly formatting what goes in parentheses and where the period goes, and that you're making good use of that final piece of bread, that you're giving some kind of explanation as to why you would include this in a paper, how it ties in, that sort of thing. So make sure you do that correctly, because I am going to count off if you don't do it correctly. So as always, if you have any questions about anything, first of all, make use of your Bridging the Difference book, or you can Google solutions. But if you have other questions, you can always email me.